Okay, so we are in 1 Corinthians and we are in chapter 4. We are going to go way deep into chapter 4 today. We are going to get one sentence. I actually like this in the NIV best, so I'm going to read it from the NIV. I have my New American Standard is what I'll be reading out of for the rest of it, but I like the way the NIV says this. It says, "Men ought to regard us as servants of Christ and as those entrusted with the mysteries God has revealed." This is a very interesting transition that Paul is going into here, because he's just come out of 1 Corinthians chapter 3, where he talks about the fact that, these people have got some challenges as far as, wanting to be just like the world. And he calls it being fleshly or being carnal. And sarcosis is actually the word. It's interesting, I found out that word for fleshly is actually now a word that has been carried over into cancer treatment. Did you know that? It was really interesting when I saw that, because this idea of being fleshly is really about being finite. And what he wanted them to understand is that they're really eternal, and that you need to focus on those things which are eternal. He then, carries that into his second letter to them when he says, "Seek not those things which are seen, but those things which are unseen, because the things which are seen are temporal," same real word, "and the things which are unseen are eternal." And he says, and we know that this earthly tent that we find ourselves in, this earthly body, is going to pass away. He says, I don't want you to have jealousy and carnality and all these other things, strife, divisions, because those are really all things which separate you from one another and separate you from from God. He then gets into this whole thing about the fact that Apollos planted and he watered, but it is God that gives the increase. He laid the foundation which couldn't be laid, which was already laid, which was Christ Jesus. And then he says, we as builders have to be careful how we build on that foundation. And he's talking specifically to the ministers at this point. Now, he talks to us as individuals in chapter 6, but here he's talking directly to the ministers. And he says to the ministers, I want you to be careful how you build on that foundation. And each of you are going to get your reward, whatever it is. It's either going to be in the same way that gold, silver, or granite and things which are precious will hold up against fire, or it'll be like wood, hay, and stubble, which obviously doesn't hold up at all against fire. And he says, and know you not that what you're building is the temple of God. And that word that he uses for temple there is the Greek word naos, N-A-O-S. Now, this word naos is the word that's used to describe the Holy of Holies that's in the temple. It's the seat of worship. It is the place where God is worshiped. And so he's saying to them that the church that we have today is now the seat it's where God lives. If you were Jewish and you looked at this and you said, he's saying, wait a minute, you're saying that this body of believers is the Holy of Holies? What? Really? Have you lost your mind, Paul? Okay, might be something that someone might say about that. And then he says in verse 21, he says, so then let no one boast in men, for all things belong to you. And he goes on to say, and you belong, verse 23, and you belong to Christ, and Christ belongs to God. In Greek, actually, all that says is, and you are Christ's, and Christ is God's. Christos Theos is basically all it says, is Christos Theos, which means God's Christ. And that's exactly where he's coming from here. So then he says this. He says, let a man, and that's anthropic man. That's not the specific boy. That's not a boy. Okay, it's not a male. It's men. Anthropic. Okay, anthropos is actually what it is in Greek. So he says, and let men regard us. That's this body. In this manner. Now, keep in mind, he's already said that we are the Holy of Holies. We are the place where God resides. Think about that. Okay? But then he says, as servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. Now, if ever there was a verse that almost everybody who interprets it or translates it, I don't want to say wrong, because it's not wrong, but in ways that really don't get the whole point of what he's trying to say. okay? This would be a good example. This verse has got 3 words in it that are absolutely essential for you to understand if you're going to understand the book of 1 Corinthians, because it really tells you the whole thing that he's trying to get across. So he says, look, first of all, I want you to regard. That's the first word. And the regard thing is really a big deal, because what he's saying there is that's how you are known. That's how you are known. This is how people look at you. How much do people regard you as a follower of Christ? So what he's saying is, I want you to first and foremost for people to regard you as a believer. That's what he's saying. First and foremost, I want you for people to regard. So when people think of you, they should think, oh, well, that guy's a believer. That guy's a Christian. That guy's a follower of Christ. That should be like the first thing that comes through your mind. Not that you are a motorcyclist, or that you are a football player, or that you are a lawyer, or that you are a nurse, or that you are no. First thing that should come to their mind is, this guy's a believer. The only way that can happen is if you are totally sold out to the cause, right? How many people do you know who are constantly changing careers? You're a nurse and you work for this hospital, and then you get tired of that, and you work for this doctor, and you get tired of that, and you work for this other thing, and da-da-da. Or you work over here, and you're, in our business, it happens all the time. And so what happens is, you don't get known as the fill in the blank. You get known really as the person that really they don't even know who you are. First and foremost, how do people regard you? Okay, so now he says this. He says, I want people to regard you in this fashion. He says, I want them to regard us in this fashion, in this manner, as, and then in the Bible, and in almost every one I've ever seen, they use the word servants. They use the word servants. Now, that word servant is interesting because it's this word right here. Hypeerits, a compound word. Okay? If you know anything about Greek, hypo means under. It means low. Okay? It means the lowest of, it means, to be under something. Okay? So, and hypo means under. And aretes is a really interesting word because it just means rower. That's all it means. So you put those 2 words together, under rower. So this word was created because there were galley ships that were created in Greece. They were actually created in Rome, but Rome and Greece, the same basic area. They created these galley ships. Now, remember, shipping had been going on for a long time before 2,000 years ago. It had been going on for a long time. And it was always done by sail. And it basically was how you got from one place to another. But what did you do when you couldn't put sails up because the wind wasn't blowing? You sat there. Exactly. Okay? So the Romans, being very, very important as far as getting stuff done, they believed in being on time. That was a big deal back then. And so they basically came in and they said, we got to figure out a way to get these ships there on time. Well, what do we have an excess surplus of? Slaves. We got tons of slaves, okay? And so what we'll do is we'll just take these slaves and we will take them off of the farm and we will put them into the bottom of the ship. We will stick 10-meter oars up to, imagine a 10-meter oar, okay? They had oars that were up to 10 meters long. That's 33 feet long, okay? Just to put that in perspective, all right? So 10-meter, put that in perspective, okay? This room is only about maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That would be 20 feet. This room is probably 30 feet wide. So imagine an oar that big. Okay, well, it obviously couldn't happen. You couldn't do, one person couldn't do it. So they had to stick like 3 people on the oar. And they had these guys row together. And that was a real interesting, job. But it was pretty simple. You either did it or you died. Pretty simple, okay? And so that was what an under rower was. So it was the person that was on the bottom. So the Romans basically came up with a word, or the Greeks came up with a word for this task. And guess what the word was? Hyperetes. Which means what? Under rower. Pretty simple, okay? And so they got that word. Now, what was interesting was this word found its way into the lexicon, and it started being used, oftentimes very sarcastically, by the way, for anybody that was really under somebody's thumb. So if you were under somebody's thumb, for example, it was used in the book of John by John throughout chapters 18 and 19. You can read it on your own. I don't need to get into it today. But in chapters 18 and 19, he actually uses this word to describe the people that were basically working at the behest of the chief priest, because the chief priest didn't have the guts to do it himself. So he sent these guys out. In the English, we say the word officer. In Greek, it's the word under-rowers. Okay? And hyperetes is not a nice word, is my point. Okay? It's a word that you used oftentimes to describe someone who was really a pain, somebody that was, just didn't have an opinion of their own. It was that kind of a thing. But more importantly, it was somebody that was under the subordination of somebody else. They couldn't do anything about their situation. That was really the idea behind it. And that's why John used it there. Luke used it as well. It was used 20 times in the New Testament, almost all of which was used in the Gospels, 15 times used in the Gospels, 4 times in the book of Acts, and only 1 time in the epistles. And guess when that was? Right here. Now, why would Paul have gone to that extreme to use this word for these people at that time? What was special about Corinth? You're right, there was an isthmus that stuck out. This was the most logical place for people to either port or to bring their ships so that they could get more supplies. So oftentimes they wouldn't even actually port there. They would just go in, resupply, and leave. But it was a very, very active kind of port city. So everybody was familiar with the idea of an under-rower. Everybody. Not only were they familiar with an actual under-rower, but they were also familiar with its slang and its derogatory meaning to most people. Does everybody understand where I'm coming from? Okay? Because that's really what... Now, what's interesting is the English translators of Greek, and I get where they're coming from, I don't even disagree with them, would actually use all sorts of different words except for the word under-rower. You never see the word under-rower actually in any translation for this word, although that's clearly what the word is. Hyperetes. It's the only thing it can be, okay? But no one uses that because they don't know what it means. No one knows what the word means. And so if I start using words in a translation that no one knows what it means, and even if they look it up, there is no word under-rower in English, by the way. Look it up. I did. It's not in. So it's just 2 words. Okay, so again, it's not a good way to translate things. So they came up with other expressions they could use for that. And so they came up with servant, they came up with minister, they came up with officer, they came up with all sorts of different, words. Okay? But the truth was, this was a derogatory kind of lowest on the rung kind of person. And a person that was not looked on, not regarded with any real sympathy, and clearly not without any, status. If you were the lowest guy in the bottom of the boat, who cares about you? The guy sitting next to you might care about you because he needs you to pull that 10 meter oar, okay? And after that, it gets slim pickings. Would you agree? Okay? There was another word he could have used if he just wanted to say slaves, because in Greek, that's the word doulos. And we see that all the time. It's probably, 100 different times in the New Testament, they use the word doulos to explain servant or bond servant or whatever. In fact, Paul calls himself that on almost every preamble of every letter. Paul, a bond servant of Christ. Remember that? You see that? Well, that's the word doulos. So that's a word that all of the translators get, because they just go, oh yeah, that's bond servant. Yeah, we get that. But this under-rower word, they just sort of like, well, what are we going to call it? And I'm really surprised it's never translated slave. Never translated slave. What? Because we already have a word for slave. Okay? So we got to come up with another word. And so they came up with these different words. And I find that absolutely fascinating. King James says it this way. It says that we should be accounted as ministers of Christ. That's how they say it. Ministers of Christ. So again, coming back to the way that they also did it in Luke's gospel. So what's the big deal? The Bible calls us slaves. The Bible calls us stewards. The Bible calls us these words because God is in charge. Okay? God is in charge. And what Paul was basically saying to the Corinthians, who didn't think anything was in charge except them, who thought they were extremely special, who thought that they were, well, I am of this, and that was why he said, why do you boast? Obviously, this was a problem. This issue of pride and so on was a problem. And so Paul was trying to bust down that. So what he did is he called them the most derogatory thing he could think of without swearing. Why would Paul do that? Why would Paul use a word that is so negative? I realized it's not negative. It's really amoral. Under-rowers in Greek society were non-people. You have to view yourselves as on this earth as really being insignificant. Why? Because your place is not here. Your place is with Him, and that's a whole different concept. And that is the hardest concept for people to get into their brains. The whole idea that we are eternal beings is hard for us to get our arms around. It really is. It's virtually impossible. I'm telling you, that is a problem that everybody has. How do I explain heaven? How do I explain the fact that I'm not going to be on this earth forever? And so on. So Paul said, look, I want you to think about yourself on earth as being of the lowest caliber. Because where you are here is not important. Where you are as a steward of, and here's what's really interesting. This is the second thing that completely blew me away when I read it. I looked up the word mysteries. In the Greek text, it's actually naos. It's this word right here for the Holy of Holies. This idea that we are stewards of God's mysteries, of the things which are important to Him. That's the idea. The point is that we are stewards of the things which are important to God, not the things that are necessarily important to everybody else. And that is a hard concept. I need you guys to kind of get with me here, because if you can get this idea that we are not only under rowers for Christ or of Christ, but we are also stewards of God's mysteries, of the things which are His, then it changes the whole way in which you start thinking about things. Because I'm telling you, we spend most of our time paying attention to things which are not going to last. We spend the vast majority of our time, think about it, spending and concentrating on things which are not going to last. I spent the entire day yesterday working with a friend of mine, helping him redo some electrical and other things in his bathroom. And after I left, I said, wow, we did this great job. We got it all done and so forth. And then it dawned on me that it's not going to last. So what was important about yesterday was not that we spent time redoing this electrical and plumbing and drywall and all that kind of stuff. What was important was we had a relation between the two of us, and we were honoring Christ in that relationship. Do you understand where I'm coming from? That's what we need to be focusing on. Not the job that we were doing, but the things which are there, which are eternal. That's what's going to last. What's going to last is the fact that he and I spent all this time together and were able to really fellowship and really work some things. It was great. But the work that we actually were there doing was not even important. It was under rower stuff. Do you start to see where I'm coming from now? You see, working on the plumbing was just under rower stuff. Working on the electric was just under rower stuff. Cutting the drywall and putting up new one, it was just under rower stuff. What was really cool was when we were talking about the mysteries of God. When we were talking about the things of God, when we were relating to one another, when we were focusing on being the friends that we truly are in Christ. Does everybody see where I'm coming from? This is what Paul is basically trying to say, is you got to take your mind and move it. Now, that does not mean you don't do the plumbing. That does not mean that you don't do the underrowing. It just means that you change what's important. It's not the underrowing it's important. Look, remember what I said to you? The only person that underrower was important to was who? The guy next to him. Because why? Why was that guy important? They needed one another. They needed one another. And that's what God has called us. If you want to truly understand the mysteries, is that we need one another. We need one another to grow. We need one another to be what we are. We need one another. That's what's important. And everything else is just underrower stuff. That's really all it is. And I just, when I started to get my arms around this, it really was amazing, especially when you consider it in the context of the Corinthians, who understood this probably more than any other thing. I think of the only description I can think of an underrower would be the Charlton Heston movie Ben-Hur. In that movie, Charlton Heston is a Jewish guy who gets bound up and thrown into slavery along with his whole family and finds himself as an underrower. And the basic idea of this movie is that he goes and he tries his hardest to figure out a way out of this dilemma, but there's no way out until on a chance meeting he meets whom? Jesus Christ. So here's this Jewish guy who becomes a slave and an underrower, comes and finds that his only escape from being an underrower is a chance meeting with Jesus Christ who frees him. It is true that hypeteres is a word that's used to describe a subordinate by the Greeks. It's a nasty word and all that kind of stuff, but I'm telling you right now, there are some interesting analogies that we can grab from this. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to give you 5 ideas that I got from being an underrower that I really want you to kind of think about. Okay, if I'm an underrower, the first thing that is probably and maybe even the most important thing is that I have to row to the beat of the captain. If you ever watch a rowing team, and basically these guys that do this rowing are in what we call eights. That means there's 8 rowers, 4 on each side. And at the very front of the boat, which by the way is really the back of the boat because rowers of course go backwards, okay? So they're rowing backwards, so they can't what? They can't see, right? So there's a guy that's up at the very front, or what we call the prow of the shell, okay? And at the prow of the shell is this guy, and does anybody know what that guy's called? Coxswain, exactly, okay? So this guy's called a coxswain, Coxswain, okay? So that coxswain is up there, and his or her job, it's mostly hers, because they're light. That's why they use girls a lot. Okay, they need somebody up there as light as possible because obviously you don't want more weight on the boat than you have to have. So they use usually very, very small girls. And so the girl is up there, and there's only 2 responsibilities for that person. Number 1, they have to weigh as little as possible, and number 2, they have to have lungs which are just amazing. Okay, because they are calling out what? The cadence, the beat. Okay, and she's going ho, 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 ho. All right, and you need to go to her beat. And that's what it's all about. She is running the boat. She's not doing any of the work, but she is running the boat. Does everybody understand that? And by the way, she is responsible for directing the boat. She's responsible for having them turn a little bit to the right or turn a little bit to the left if they start to sway a little bit. Her responsibility completely. Their responsibility is what? To row. Okay? So, She is, so think about this. Her responsibility, the coxswain's responsibility, is to keep the rowers in what?
Sync.
In sync. Because you can have the strongest rowers in the world, but if they are not in sync, you lose. Right? In fact, you can have actually some weak rowers and have them in sync, and you'll win. It's really interesting. And in rowing, I loved rowing for a lot of reasons, but one of the main reasons that I loved rowing was that it was totally dependent upon technique. You didn't have to be the strongest guy in the entire planet to be a good rower. You just had to have good technique. And that's really what it's all about. So they had a captain of the rowers, this coxswain, but the coxswain got her orders, or if you think about it, in that big boat, got her orders from whom? From the captain, right? I mean, the captain basically says, okay, this is the way we're going. And he calls the shot. This is the way we're going. And then, of course, all the subordinates to him basically get it down to the coxswain, and the coxswain basically tells the rowers, okay, this is what we're going to do. And back in those days, they had these big drums, and they would hit these drums, and they would pound the drum, and you had to basically work to the pound of that drum. And it didn't matter what time of the day it was. It didn't matter where it was. You had to do it in perfect timing. So the second thing is they had to row together. Because if I'm on a 10-meter oar, and obviously I need someone else to help me with that, I got to do that together. I can't have one person pushing while the other person's pulling, right? I can't have one person rolling when the other person's not rolling, because that's what happens in a rowing stroke. By the way, you pull back and then you flip it and you bring it up, and then you pull it back and you flip it, so that's how you row. You got to get that paddle out of the water so it can swing back all the way over, and then boom, come and dig again. Does everybody understand the concept? And so you can't run the paddle across the water. The other thing that's interesting is you have to have when it's coming back, when the oar is coming back, it has to come back at a very specific angle, because if it comes back like this, it actually creates drag. And when I say this, I mean like at a 45-degree angle. If you come back at a 45-degree angle, it creates drag. So you've got to try to get that thing as flat to the horizon as you can possibly do. So that's the goal. The goal is to get it as flat to the horizon. Well, I want you to think about this. You got 150 of these rowers, that are in the bows of the ship. They all have one of these, maybe there's 50 oars then that are sticking out. There's 3 on each oar. And these guys are all working together. What happens if one of them gets out of sync? It's a mess. What typically happens to that person? Disciplined. Exactly. They don't kill them, by the way. That's a misnomer. They can't afford to kill them. What does God do to us when we're out of sync? He doesn't kill us, but he does discipline us. Isn't this? I mean, it's a really fascinating thing. The third thing is, and this is really interesting, they had to trust the captain. Now, what's interesting was, I want you to think about the chain of command. Number one, they had to trust the person sitting next to them, right? Clearly. That was the most important person they had to trust. The second thing they had to do is they had to trust the coxswain, right? Because certainly they wanted to make sure they were doing it to the beat. They had to trust that the beat was right. But the ultimate person they had to trust was the captain, who was directing the ship and directing the whole operation. They had to make sure that they absolutely trusted him. So there's levels of trust that they had to find themselves in. Now I want you to think about this. We are the under rowers. So not only do we have to trust God, but we have to trust those people that we're associated with. We have to trust those people that we're closest with. We have to trust those people who are teaching us at the pastoral level and so on. We have to trust these people, because we have to trust that they are in fact listening to the great captain, which of course in this case is God. Okay? So here, this is really important. Look, if you think about it, a lot of time was spent by these people in pitch black. We're in this room, there's lights on, fluorescence, all this other kind of stuff, and it's daylight. We still have lights on, Okay? Because that's the proper thing to do. I'm not finding anything wrong with that. But if you're in the bowels of a ship, most of the time in the bowels of the ship, the only light that you're getting is through the holes where the oars come out. That's it. And if it's dark out, maybe because it's raining or because it's just nighttime, it's pitch black. Now, I want you to think for 1 second about how difficult it would be to row in pitch black. Now, for the most part, I'm thinking they didn't actually make them row at night, but there had to be times when they had to do it. I'm sure that they didn't always want to, row through a great storm, but there are times when they were caught in a storm. And a great deal of their time was spent in pitch black. And there was nothing really they could do about it. So they had to trust one another to be able to do that, to be successful, and as I wrote here, and thus stay alive, not because they were going to kill them, but because it just was going to kill them. It wasn't because the guards were going to go in there and start beating them, because they didn't want to lose their people. Okay, so they didn't go in there and start killing these people. That's a misnomer. Okay. The other thing is a lot of people actually like being underrowers because underrowers actually, believe it or not, although they were locked in, were basically treated relatively well considering. So it was an interesting thing. But they had to have total faith and obedience in the coxswain, and they also had to have the same kind of obedience and faith in the captain. So they had to trust the captain. They had to trust their leadership. One other point on that, just before I forget. The Hyperetes were not permitted to question. This is really interesting. They were not permitted to question. Now, I'm sure they questioned in their own minds, but they were not permitted to question. I think what's really cool about our job is that God allows us to question. And I'm not suggesting that questioning or not questioning, but the underrowers were not allowed to question. They didn't have any rights whatsoever. They didn't have anything that was going on that was going to help them and so forth. Their job was to row to that drum, nothing more, nothing less. The fourth thing that we learned from these guys is committed for life. Once you got this job, you were in it. You wasn't getting out of this job. Okay? Retirement, right? Yeah, there wasn't any retirement. This was a one-way trip. Is what I saw one guy write. I thought that was interesting. There's a one-way trip. Okay? And that's the way it is for us as believers. Look, you make this commitment forever. This is a commitment forever. You are saying, look, I am committed to eternity. I'm committed to this as long as I'm here for sure. And here's the deal. That's not necessarily a bad thing. This idea that you can constantly change your calling is really not necessarily a good idea. So again, we come back to this, that they were committed to this for life. And then finally, I love this. They, meaning the underrowers, received no glory. No one even knew they existed. In fact, the only time the captain would know an underrower existed is if he did something which impacted the captain. Guess, how often would that happen? Not very often. In fact, my goal as an underrower would to know the guy next to me and the people around me, but to have no knowledge of the captain. Okay, because to have knowledge of the captain is probably a bad thing. But only the captain, really, if you think about it, was known to anyone in the outer world. The Hyperetes were invisible. They were unrewarded by the world. If they were visible, it was because they weren't doing their job. So, likewise for us, we are submissive to Christ's beat. We work in harmony with the other rowers. We trust the captain, Christ, implicitly. We're willing to give everything for Christ. And I think this is really the most important thing. We give all the glory to God. The underrowers did their job out of fear and bondage. We do our jobs knowing that the captain's looking out for our best interest. And that's the big distinction. We don't live in fear and bondage. We are not in fear and bondage. Christ has never called us to that. But Paul is very clear in the 6th chapter, when we get into the 6th chapter, we'll see this, where he says, you are bought with a price, you are not your own. And I think this is important because the difference between, there is a major difference between believers and under-rowers. The under-rowers were held in shackles and chains. We are volunteers for service. We volunteer for this. We say, look, you know what? I want this. I want to be there. Imagine for 1 second the impact it would have if someone volunteered to be one of those under-rowers. They were there because they wanted to be there to serve the captain, to serve the people that were next to them. There's a really neat verse, we'll end on this, in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 14 that says this, for the love of Christ controls us, having concluded this, that one died for all, therefore all died. And he died for all, that they who live should no longer live for themselves, but for him who died and rose again on their behalf. To me, that's the beauty of our choice. Yes, we are under-rowers of Christ. But you know what? There's a second part to this. And that is that we are stewards of the mysteries of God. And Stevie will be giving that to you next week.